Enjoy the show? Consider checking out the Lost Sun Society Patreon, which has all the episodes ad-free forever and much more to come in the future. Go to patreon.com/Lost Sun Society or check out the link in the description. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Lost Sun Society. Episode 6, Unravelling. One of the most fascinating assumptions of the pre-war world, when it came to the idea of the apocalypse, was that it would be one great leap into bloodshed and lawless killing. And in a way, it certainly was. I mean, the casualties from the 12 minutes are a testament to that. There was, however, no immediate outbreak of lawlessness. Neighbours did not start killing neighbours after the bombs fell. People did not just up and jump into anarchy. They tried to help each other. They had to help each other. There was no other option. Community was really the only route out. And although we see that conception of community change and take on new forms with the RSGs and beyond, it remains community. But behind that, there is a profound change happening. It happens slowly. It happens one day at a time. And it happens without the conscious thought of most of those caught in it. That change is the rising violence and the grim acceptance of force. As we read the story of the aftermath period, we witness a generation, the survivor generation, slowly begin to unwind all of the precedents, rules, and morals that had dictated their lives before the war. And all of that leads to the ascendancy of Caspar Lockridge. It leads to the half-parliament, to figures like Jacob Trevelyan, Michaela Levine, and Miles Rosdale. It leads to the end of the United Kingdom. And tragically, it leads to all the mud, blood, and frozen corpses of the Sunless War. But it all starts here, in the spring of 2045, and it happens one step at a time. The winter of 2044 was long, and it was difficult. The false spring and then summer of the previous year had left many of the RSGs ill-prepared for the sub-zero temperatures that accompanied the return to winter proper. And the issue of food and the issue of shelter were once again the primary concern of the commissioners and their authorities. Daily bread was not a guarantee, not even in the places most equipped to deal with them. And it contributed to an overwhelming sense of suffocation amongst the population of the RSGs. That was to say nothing of the White Banner communities, or even the Have-Nothings, both of whom could not expect any help from the RSGs. The only positive to the winter of 2044 was that it had seemingly frozen the issue of the Bandit Kings. Much like those in the bunkers, the bandits and their leaders were stuck in place for large portions of the winter, only occasionally striking out for the sake of food. What's interesting is that, from what we can tell, a large portion of the leadership of the RSGs were fully prepared to believe that the winter would be so harsh that the issue of the bandits would be dealt with, and they weren't exactly foolish to believe so. For Ilsa and her architects, meanwhile, this was an opportunity to push through the last of the negotiations for the National Reconstruction Committee, which were nearing completion. There had been significant delays over interpretations of the role of the RSGs within the framework of the committee. Were the RSGs going to be beneath the committee? Were they going to serve alongside the committee? Or was something going to replace them? It wasn't entirely clear until it was all hashed out in the negotiations. But as these negotiations dragged on, Ilsa and the architects were beginning to splinter within their own coalition, whilst the opposition to the architects was finally beginning to come together. So, as Ilsa was stuck treading familiar ground, she was going to be effectively blind to the weaknesses of her own allies and the rising threat of those who opposed her. But we'll come back to this in a moment. Now, things are going to get complicated, and they're all going to start happening at the same time, right as spring returns to the Isles. I think, when all is said and done, we can point to the unravelling of the Isles really beginning in March of 2045, and where it starts to unravel is Yorkshire. The hills have been rumbling before this point, but that March is when the avalanches are finally going to start coming down. I didn't delve too deep into the individual situations of the RSGs in previous episodes because, frankly, there's just far too many of them, and try to keep you up to date on the individual failings or issues of each of these regions would have meant that we spent hundreds of minutes discussing those issues before we even got to this point. Unfortunately for me, however, some of the individual situations can no longer be ignored. Yorkshire has had a long and storied history, one which any northern soul could rattle on about for hours. But by the time of the 12 minutes and the ensuring systems collapse, the region was condensed into RSG 2.1, which is better known as the North East RSG. The early history of the North East RSG is mired in conflicting reports, conflicting agendas, and imperfect histories. What we know is that in many regions there had only been a slim minority of sitting members of parliament who had turned up to the doorsteps of the bunkers, and who then had assumed complete authority with relative ease. In the northeast, however, it appears that there wasn't a small minority of parliamentarians, but an entire clique of them. 3 MPs, one Joseph Cook, Benji Harvey, and Nancy Hughes, had risen to the top of the pile, and none of them was really prepared to accept the authority of the other two. Where most of the RSGs had been able to muddle through the inconsistencies and shapeless boundaries of the aftermath, the Northeast RSG was unique in how the sharp boundaries immediately formed within the commissioners and administrators of the bunker itself. Joseph opposed Benji, who was undermining Nancy, who was using Joseph. And we don't really know why. Was it ideological? Was it former grudges? Or was it all just petty personal reasons? Either way, there were 3 groups that formed, and each of them viscerally despised the others, operating as if they were all just mere roadblocks to their more supreme administration of the RSG. By early 2044, the triad of MPs had survived a year together, and they had done so out of necessity. But by late 2044, the divides between the 3 had only grown more and more pronounced. The harsh winter exacerbated these tensions. There wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough shelter, and the bunker itself had experienced a number of technical faults that each of the triad had been convinced was the work of one of the other 2. And make no mistake, this was not just confined to the ranks of commissioner, nor the administrators who had aligned themselves with one of the triad. It had spilled out to the skilled and unskilled civilians who began to suspect that maybe their leaders didn't have their best interests in mind. The soldiers who received conflicting orders, who had to cope with the fact that the leaders above them were acting in a blatantly partisan fashion, struggled to operate from one day to the next. And all of this was just barely fine. It was holding together by the skin of its teeth until March of 2045 rolled around. We don't know whether things had already started falling apart, whether the knives had already been drawn, but whether they had started killing each other or not, a bandit who had come to be known as Grinning Reese emerged from the winter, and it all just collapsed. The Battle of Shipton was the first battle on British soil for generations. Really, though, it was hardly a battle. The skies had been spitting grey, dusty rain for hours prior to the arrival of Reese. Everybody was out of the rain, and nobody could have been less prepared to fight for their lives. A few scattered accounts recall that the bandits strolled in from the hills and were met with farcical resistance. A couple of ardent soldiers put up an hour's worth of fighting before conditions forced them into a surrender. The vast majority of the soldiers, however, treated the bandits as if they were here to help, and a few even offered to trade with them. Within hours, the administrators of the Northeast RSG had opened the doors to the bunkers, and the Bandit King was welcomed in as a victor. All three of the commissioners, whatever state they were in at this point, were immediately placed under arrest. And because everybody was so eager to agree to this, they happily overlooked the fact that nobody there had the authority to arrest them. The RSGs outside of Yorkshire were informed via the intranet, quite politely, that the Northeast RSG had been reorganised and that a new arrangement would soon be transmitted. Anyone with any sense could read between the lines. The Battle of Shipton and the affairs that follow could almost be described as undramatic, but they immediately ignited a firestorm. Any assumptions about the hard winter of 2044 dealing with the bandit threat was dispelled immediately. Nobody had really expected any of the Bandit Kings to attempt to take one of the bunkers. The assumption of the core RSGs had been that they were impregnable, and now one of them had just been taken, and it had happened in no time at all, with very little resistance to speak of. The fall of the Northeast RSG was unprecedented. It was the nightmare scenario for every commissioner and every authority. But it had also been assumed that the greatest threats to their existence would be natural, whether that was starvation or radiation or otherwise, and instead it had now been proven that this entire state of affairs could be torn down at any moment by any random person with a gun and a grudge. To say that the responses verged on insanity would be a severe understatement. At this point in 2045, you have to remember that we are not that far removed from the 12 minutes. And one of the things I bet you might have forgotten about that was that there was never an official end to the war that began the nuclear exchange. The 12 minutes had simply annihilated the global communication networks and plunged everyone into an imposed isolation, and many within the bunkers were now suddenly beginning to remember that they were not alone in the world. What immediately began to form in the swirling uncertainty of the hours and days after the fall of the Northeast RSG could only be described as a far-reaching narrative of imminent and complete invasion of the United Kingdom, facilitated by internal assets of a foreign government. In some variations of it, the Bandit Kings were activated sleeper agents. In other variations, the Bandit Kings were actually soldiers who had sailed across the North Sea to begin their invasion. If you followed this conspiracy, there were threats everywhere. They were coming for you right now, and there was no time to do anything but prepare to fight for the soul of the nation. And this narrative just exploded into every single one of the RSGs at once. There was a marked increase in violence all across the country. The soldiers, who before had been policing a variety of petty crimes, took to ousting anyone they suspected of being in alignment with the Bandit Kings. In many cases, the authorities tried in vain to reel in the worst impulses of their subordinates. In other cases, the authorities actively egged them on. This would become known as the outside threat conspiracy, or just the outside conspiracy. But then we have the other side of the coin, which was that there was a large portion of the population who had been living in what can only be described as squalor. Many of them had been experiencing this squalor prior even to the 12 minutes. They had only experienced a world where things got worse and worse. And who was responsible for this? Well, all of these people had their fingers pointed squarely at the men in the bunkers. Before the war or after the war, there were always guys in bunkers, and they were never you. So, the fall of the RSG was finally it. It was finally the beginning of someone doing something about those pricks in the bunkers. It was the first domino of a great and sweeping kickback to all of the horrible things that they had been forced to endure for so many years. This was a viewpoint most common amongst the have-nothings, naturally, but it had its roots in the unskilled citizens and the soldiers as well, because you weren't immune to rubbish conditions just because you had a job, or a gun. Suddenly, the question of what the hell you were doing playing into this whole system was up in the air. Maybe it was finally time to kick the whole can over and start again. Look for data from March 2045 and you will see a spike in desertions, mutinies, robberies, arsons, and every manner of crime, both petty and not. As I mentioned in the last episode, the enduring myth of the Bandit Kings is one that paints them as gleeful tricksters and liberators against a backdrop of immovable, authoritarian tyrants. And where does that myth begin? Right here, in March of 2045. For the most part, Ilsa Ludek and her architects could not have possibly been prepared for the explosive effects of these events. The issues of the Northeast RSG were entirely of their own making, and we have no idea how much the commissioners that she was aligned with actually knew about any of those issues. But the one thing we know for certain is that all of those commissioners were not in Yorkshire. The Central Commissioner, as you all doubt know, was located just outside of Oxford, and so there were hundreds of miles between her and the upstarts who had just waltzed into a bunker and declared themselves the legitimate representatives of the RSG. It might have been trivial before the war, but now that distance seemed insurmountable. The physical geography of the aftermath period is often disregarded or forgotten in favour of the big names and big events. But in reality, it made all of this happen just as much as any of the other factors. The logistical nightmare that would have involved trying to marshal any response to the Battle of Shipton would have been a headache, and it would have involved corralling soldiers across the country in conditions that could scarcely be described as spring-like, with no promise of any rewards or any positive outcome other than a couple of tumours for your trouble. The Yorkshire landscape was famously bitter and lethal in the aftermath period, and any soldier worth his daily bread would have stared down an ash storm on the rugged moors and decided that it was just not worth it. So, what response could Ilsa Ludek offer? She was not, remember, a politician, nor was she a general. She was just an architect, and it was becoming apparent that the situation was spiralling and spiralling. The response amongst her allies was predictably scattered. The architects were not a formal coalition, nor did they abide by any particularly strict ideology or rule set. Of the commissioners that she had corralled to her side, 2 of them had already quietened to the point of being considered non-allies, and the rest were split into unclear groupings. The first group believed entirely in the vision that Ilsa had laid out, and argued that with the finalisation of the National Reconstruction Committee, they could push through a system through which the patchwork remnants of the RSG soldiery could be reformed back into something resembling the military of the United Kingdom, which would allow the politicians to hand over control of the situation back to the military administrators. The other group of architects, meanwhile, thought that this plan was insanity, and that by the time this was organised, the architects would be out in the wastes because the entire system would have collapsed. The only response was economic. It was to bring the fallen RSG back into the fold via material incentives, which would force the bandits to work with the systems that the commissioners had control over. It was clear that the problem had not been military, and it could not be solved militarily. The soldiers hadn't fought back from lack of organisation, it was a lack of basic necessities. But all of these debates were taking place via the infranet, absorbing an enormous amount of time and political air, and there was a very real possibility that they could have been doing this whilst all the further outside cascaded into further collapses of the RSG system, and Ilsa Ludek needed to offer something now. And so, perhaps sealing her fate in future days, Ilsa took advice from an outside counsel. We haven't spent much time with Caspar Lockridge since the 12 minutes occurred, but we do know that he had negotiated himself to the position of commissioner in the southwest region, where he had surrounded himself with lackeys and ideologues from the days of the Wednesday Club. Since then, he had ostensibly remained on the sidelines of the internal struggles of the Infranet and the National Reconstruction Committee. He had not made himself the most vocal opponent of the architects in Ilse-Ludek, and he had offered both varying levels of support and disapproval, but only when it suited him. And oh, had Caspar been busy whilst this had been happening. Caspar Lockridge had come to realise the importance of the geography of the RSGs, and he had realised that when it came to the opponents of Ilse-Ludek, there was a line of them that stretched across the southern coast of England. His RSG, the Southwest, was supported by opponents of Ludek to the west, in an RSG that covered Cornwall, as well as an RSG to the east, which covered the Isle of Wight and Southampton, with one final RSG that went all the way along to Canterbury. This formed an unbroken stretch of territory across the southern coast, who were, all of them, broadly aligned but entirely leaderless. The reign of the architects had been propelled by an early momentum during that first year, but it had struggled to convert any of that momentum into physical action, in part due to the vast distances between the allied RSGs. Lockridge's RSGs, on the other hand, would be able to coordinate together and move together with relative ease. They would not resemble a disconnected group of local authorities, but a single, organised state. Lockridge had begun to pull this group together and then bind them, and he had made sure that it was only able to succeed due to him. Part of this was, once again, because of the geography. Lockridge's RSG was a bridge between the western and eastern portions of this alliance, and they couldn't operate independently without support from Lockridge alone. And they would all of them be given an ideological backbone through Lockridge's application of the ideas of the Wednesday Club. The architects wanted to build a new future, but they wanted to do so without any of the fundamental pillars of Britain. No, salvation would arrive via crown, parliament, and military. This group would come to have many, many names, and we will in time know them as the emergency government. For now, however, we can simply call them the Crown Group. By the March of 2045, the outside conspiracy had galvanised his allies in the Crown Group, and many of the administrators who had been working beneath them, because it provided what appeared to be an existential threat to the United Kingdom. The wild fantasies of the Wednesday Club had always been based in a fanatical call to defend the Isles from outside invaders, and, well, here it was. They were coming to take us down, and we had to be ready to fight to the death to stop it. But Lockridge was also canny enough at this time to recognise that he could not pull the trigger on this without beginning some cataclysmic struggle between the RSGs, the outcome of which would almost certainly be anarchy. He instead became keenly aware of the weakness of the architect coalition, with Ilse at its core, and so presented himself as a salve to their problems. He had not, as of yet, been that much of a vocal opponent of the architects. He had kept his criticisms behind closed doors, and so he could offer himself up as a concerned party attempting to bridge the gap between bickering factions. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Caspar argued that the RSGs had been crippled by a state of legal and practical limbo. It was no surprise that the soldiers of the North East RSG had failed to act, because they had no idea how they were supposed to act. The only option was that the National Reconstruction Committee needed to ratify a declaration of emergency. The declaration of emergency was a blindingly simple solution. It was, effectively, the final and official announcement that all of Britain was operating under a state of martial law without exception, and that, without question, the use of force was authorized for any situation or any person that could be deemed a threat to the state. It was the full stop under the question of legalized force. If you were not obeying the authority of the RSGs, you were acting against the interests of the British people and could then be detained or, more likely, shot without trial. Lockridge argued that it was a shocking indictment that this had not already have occurred, and it would have almost certainly been the first act of the Prime Minister if he had still been alive, and that it would be the most clear-cut method of assuring the people of the United Kingdom that there was a single national response to the threat of the rogue forces roaming the countryside. It was also brilliant in how cleanly it avoided the headache of military organisation. The idea was to simply unshackle what already existed and provide clear guidelines for their operation. They could tackle the question of national organisation as soon as they understood how they were supposed to act anyway. It is the greatest of shames that the infranet logs between Caspar and Ilsa at this moment have been lost to the later purges. They are one of the foundational conversations of the post-war period. It is another crystal clear moment in the unravelling of an order that had been established 100 years early. How quickly had Ilsa warmed to the idea? How long had Caspar spent convincing her? What words did he use? What doubts did she have? We will simply never know. Ilsa Ludek returned to the commissioners of the RSGs and announced that the best course of action would be to ratify a declaration of emergency. Caspar Lockridge immediately made clear his support for this action and was joined by a chorus of voices from other commissioners who had been entirely opposed to the National Reconstruction Committee at this point. The Crown Group had one voice. It would have appeared miraculous to see the entire structure of the RSGs working in unison at this point, and I doubt many of the architects had the foresight to recognise that they were being baited into doing the work of their very own opposition. The Declaration of Emergency was published on the 14th of March 2045. It was a mere 4 days after the Battle of Shipton. Outside of the RSGs, in the spaces where it took days for news of this declaration to arrive, it was met with an uncertain response. Everyone who did not recognise the supreme authority of the RSGs was potentially going to be marked an enemy. Preppers, white banners, have-nothings. Was it really going to tar them all with the same brush? They were going to be given the same standing as bandits, looters, anarchists. It seemed implausible, but not impossible. You're also no doubt curious what the Bandit Kings thought of this, and the truth is that they were rather drunk on their own unchallenged supremacy at this point in time. So much so that they believed the declaration of emergency represented the outright collapse of the RSG system, and they were about to inherit the Earth. They had really begun to believe the hysterical declarations of a new dawn that had been repeated by the have-nothings, and they had begun to make a series of sweeping promises to whoever was listening. The most infamous of these is, of course, the pamphlet simply entitled Springtime, with an exclamation mark, in which it is declared that a new brotherhood of man was about to be created across the length and breadth of the Isles, and that it would bring with it a return to a natural state of peace, unity, and brotherly democracy. It makes several bold claims about the demolition of all unnatural hierarchies and the creation of a system of equitable distribution to strangle the tyrant, as well as return to a time when men were better and, for some reason, harder. It's a shame we never get to see exactly what this would entail, because I've always been rather curious. Still, in contrast to the common historiography, the declaration of emergency did not lead to an immediate butchering of the Bandit Kings. Truth be told, we don't even know if many of them had ever intended to attack the other bunkers. Instead, the declaration of emergency galvanized many of the commissioners to take actions that they probably should have already done. Finally, the bandits were going to be treated like a real threat. The military authorities were going to be allowed to act with their own accord, and the spring of 2045 was finally going to mark the beginning of a return to normalcy. But despite the declaration of emergency, the question of the Northeast RSG had not been answered, despite provocations by Grinning Reese on the intranet itself, and it was becoming clear that it was going to have to be solved, or the hysteria that was sweeping the nation was going to consume every last RSG. The answer was not going to arrive immediately, but Lockridge himself had no doubts that it was going to require the application of force. Next episode, we're going to see that application of force and meet the men and women who would become the dreaded Barracuda set, a name they would earn through blood and blood alone. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, do go support us on Patreon. It's the best and most direct way to ensure that the show can keep going, and you get access to all the episodes without any of the annoying ads. All the tiers get access to the same content, so you can pay as much or as little as you want. Go to patreon.com/LostSonSociety, all one word, or check out the link in the description. I'll see you next episode.